National Guard targets suspicious black man, unaware. He is a Delta Force commander. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows down the narrow streets of the city. It was the kind of day where the air was heavy, not with weather but with tension. People hurried along the sidewalks carrying groceries, bags, or simply trying to make it home before the bustle of traffic consumed the city. No one expected anything unusual to happen. No one expected a scene that would stop them in their tracks and etch itself into their memory forever. In the middle of the street, a man walked calmly, dressed simply in a fitted gray t-shirt and dark jeans. His stride was steady, powerful yet unassuming, the kind of walk that belonged to someone who had been through battles most would never imagine. His name was Marcus Steele. To strangers, he looked like just another man, strongly built, quiet, minding his own business. But behind those calm eyes lay the history of a soldier who had faced life-and-death decisions more times than he could count. Marcus wasn't there to cause trouble. In fact, minutes earlier, he had been helping an elderly woman who had stumbled while crossing the road. He had picked up her grocery bag, handed it back with a polite nod, and carried on walking. It was such a simple act of kindness, the kind of thing he always did without thinking. But in a world so quick to judge, appearances sometimes became louder than truth. Suddenly, the screech of tires and the blare of a military vehicle's siren cut through the street. Heads turned as a convoy of National Guard trucks rolled in. Soldiers in full gear jumped out, rifles raised, their boots pounding against the pavement in unison. Within seconds, the peaceful street turned into a tense standoff. People froze where they stood. Some instinctively reached for their phones, recording the unfolding chaos. Others ducked into shops, afraid of what might happen next. "Hands up or we shoot," one soldier barked, his weapon aimed directly at Marcus. Marcus stopped in his tracks, confusion flashing across his face. He glanced around, trying to understand. The rifles weren't aimed at anyone else, they were aimed at him. His chest tightened, not out of fear but out of disbelief. The crowd gasped. A mother pulled her child closer. Someone whispered, "What did he do?" Others shook their heads, muttering under their breath. But no one stepped forward. Marcus raised his hands slowly, his eyes locked on the soldiers surrounding him. His voice, deep and steady, carried across the street. "I think you've got the wrong man." But his calmness seemed only to inflame their suspicions. The young soldier on his left shouted louder, his finger trembling near the trigger. "Don't move. You fit the description. Stay where you are." Marcus clenched his jaw. He had heard those words before in other contexts in other countries. Back then, it had been hostile forces who didn't know his name, who didn't care about justice, only about control. But this wasn't a battlefield overseas. This was home. And yet, here he was, standing in the same position. A man targeted not for what he had done, but for what others assumed. The murmurs in the crowd grew louder. Some people began to argue. "He didn't do anything," one man shouted. "They think he's dangerous, just look at him." Another countered, as though strength and presence alone were a crime. Inside, Marcus fought to control his breathing. His training told him not to react, not to escalate, not to give them a reason to fire. Years of leading men into combat had taught him the value of patience, of waiting for the right moment. But this wasn't about combat. It was about survival, dignity, and truth. A soldier stepped closer, pressing the muzzle of his rifle near Marcus's chest. "You think you're tough? Let's see those hands higher," he growled. Marcus obeyed, lifting his arms a little higher. The muscles in his forearms tightened, veins visible under the skin. Every eye in the crowd was fixed on him. He felt their fear, their pity, their uncertainty, but he refused to let them see fear in his own eyes. In that instant, he remembered something his commanding officer once told him during a mission overseas. Sometimes the battle isn't won with bullets. It's won with the strength to stand your ground even when the world pushes you down. And so Marcus stood tall. The world seemed to pause. The soldiers shouted, the rifles remained trained, the crowd whispered, but Marcus was still, calm, controlled. The storm around him raged, but inside he was steady as a mountain. Minutes stretched like hours. Tension thickened the air until it felt like everyone was holding their breath. Marcus's eyes scanned the soldiers. He could see it in their faces. They were young, anxious, barely older than the men he had once trained. Their voices shook, their hands weren't steady. They didn't see him as a human being. They saw him as a threat. But what they didn't know What no one knew was that Marcus Steele had once worn a uniform not unlike theirs. He had once stood in deserts and jungles, leading elite teams into places most people couldn't even locate on a map. He had been a Delta Force commander, a man who had given his entire life to protecting the very nation whose soldiers now threatened him. The irony wasn't lost on him. As the minutes dragged on, someone from the crowd yelled, "That's Marcus Steele." Another added, "I know him, he's a veteran." But the soldiers didn't lower their weapons. They were too locked in, too wound up in their assumptions. And then, the moment that changed everything arrived. From behind the convoy, a senior officer appeared. His eyes landed on Marcus, and instantly, recognition swept across his face. His expression shifted from suspicion to shock, then to something that looked almost like fear, but not of Marcus. Fear of what they had almost done. The officer's voice cut through the noise, sharp and commanding. "Stand down! Stand down now!" The young soldiers hesitated, confusion flickering in their eyes. "Sir, he matches the—" "I said stand down!" The officer barked again, louder this time. Slowly, reluctantly, the rifles lowered. The crowd exhaled in collective relief. But Marcus didn't move. He held his ground, his hands still raised, his eyes still calm, waiting. The officer stepped forward, his voice lower now, filled with something like respect. "Commander Steele, I didn't realize." The crowd gasped. Whispers rippled through the street. "Commander Steele?" Marcus finally lowered his hands, his voice firm but steady. "You didn't need to realize who I was. You just needed to realize I'm a man." The silence that followed was heavier than the shouts that had come before. For the people who stood there that day, the image of Marcus Steele, strong, calm, dignified in the face of judgment, would burn itself into their memory. To some, he was a stranger unfairly accused. To others, he became a living reminder of the dangers of assumption and the quiet strength of resilience. And to Marcus, it was just another battle, not fought on foreign soil, but in the very heart of the home he had sworn to protect. The sound of the officer's voice still echoed in the air as the soldiers hesitantly lowered their rifles. For a few seconds, no one dared to move. The crowd remained frozen, their phones still raised, their breaths caught in their chests. It felt as though the entire city block had been holding on to one single question. What happens now? Marcus Steele lowered his hands slowly, deliberately, and the motion carried more power than words ever could. He didn't shout. He didn't lash out. He didn't storm off angrily like many might have expected. Instead, he simply stood, steady and strong, his calm presence pressing down on the chaos like an anchor in the middle of a storm. In that moment, Marcus wasn't just a man surrounded by armed soldiers. He was something bigger. He was a lesson unfolding right in front of everyone's eyes. The officer, still looking unsettled, stepped forward. His posture was stiff, his lips tight as though he had more to say but couldn't find the right words. Marcus didn't rescue him with small talk or excuses. He let the silence do its work. Silence, after all, was a language Marcus had mastered during his years of service. When you spend nights hidden in enemy territory, waiting for the right second to move, silence becomes your best friend. When you lose brothers in arms and words fail, silence becomes your only companion. And when the world judges you unfairly, silence becomes your shield, a reminder that your worth isn't decided by their voices but by the life you've lived. The crowd began to murmur, curiosity replacing fear. "Why are they calling him Commander?" one woman whispered. "He looks so calm." "I'd be screaming by now," another muttered. A young boy tugged at his mother's sleeve and asked, "Mom, who is he?" Marcus heard it all, but he didn't respond. He knew from experience that people always needed time. They needed space to process, to unlearn, to rethink. He wasn't there to give them a speech. His actions spoke louder than any speech could. The officer finally cleared his throat. I apologize, Commander Steele." His voice was low but clear enough for the nearby crowd to hear. "My men made a mistake. We thought." Marcus cut him off gently, not with anger but with quiet authority. "You thought wrong." The officer's jaw tightened, but he didn't argue. There was nothing to argue. The truth hung heavy in the air. For Marcus, this wasn't the first time he had been misjudged. It wasn't the first time he had been looked at with suspicion before being seen as human, but unlike the countless strangers who never learned the truth about him, these soldiers now knew, and perhaps, just perhaps, they would remember this moment the next time they raised their rifles at someone who didn't fit their assumptions. The crowd slowly began to disperse, whispers fading into the city's hum. Some shook their heads in disbelief, some exchanged looks of shame, and some looked at Marcus with newfound respect. But Marcus himself didn't dwell on the scene. He turned and began walking, his steps calm and unhurried, as though nothing had happened. He didn't need applause. He didn't need their pity. He didn't even need their gratitude. What mattered was holding on to his own dignity, and that no one could take from him. As he walked down the street, memories crept back into his mind, memories that shaped the calm strength he carried now. He remembered being 21, a young recruit, trembling with nerves at his first training exercise. He had been strong, yes, but strength alone didn't impress the commanders. They looked for something deeper: control, patience, resilience. While others panicked during simulations, Marcus learned to breathe, to still his hands, to silence his mind. It was that discipline that would later save lives in real combat. He remembered leading his first team into hostile territory, where every rustle of leaves could mean an ambush. His men looked to him for courage, but the truth was Marcus had been scared too. The difference was that he had learned not to let fear control him. Fear was natural. It reminded you that you were alive. But fear could also destroy you if you let it take the wheel. That day Marcus led his team safely back. Not because he wasn't afraid, but because he refused to let fear make his choices. These lessons weren't flashy. They weren't the kind of stories Hollywood turned into blockbusters. But they were the foundation of his character, the invisible armor that protected him even now, long after he had hung up his uniform. So when rifles were aimed at him, Marcus didn't react with anger or panic. He reacted with silence, with stillness, with the calm strength that had carried him through years of unseen battles. Later that evening, Marcus sat in his small apartment staring out of the window at the city skyline. The noise of the day had faded, but the memory of the confrontation lingered. Not because he was bitter, but because he knew how close things had come to ending differently. One wrong move, one louder shout, one nervous finger pulling a trigger. That was all it would have taken. Yet instead of letting anger consume him, Marcus chose reflection. He thought about the soldiers. Young, inexperienced, carrying weapons they hadn't yet learned the full responsibility of. To them, authority came from the uniform on their back, the gun in their hands. But Marcus knew the truth. Real authority came from within. It came from character, from courage, from knowing when not to pull the trigger. He thought about the crowd. Ordinary people, some quick to judge, some quick to defend, most caught somewhere in between. He didn't resent them. He understood them. People feared what they didn't know, and they assumed what they didn't understand. It was human nature. The real question was, would they learn from what they saw today? And finally, he thought about himself. Marcus had retired from active duty because he wanted peace, not recognition. He wanted to live simply, away from medals and missions, away from the constant reminder of war. But life had a strange way of reminding him that his battles weren't all behind him. Some battles weren't fought overseas. Some battles were fought right here at home, in the minds and hearts of people too blinded by prejudice to see clearly. Marcus leaned back in his chair, closing his eyes. He thought of his father's words from years ago, words that echoed louder now than ever. Son, strength isn't about how hard you hit. It's about how steady you stand when the world tries to knock you down. That was the silent strength he carried, the strength that no weapon could overpower, the strength that no misunderstanding could erase. For Marcus, the day wasn't about humiliation. It was about a test of his patience, his dignity, and his ability to hold firm when injustice tried to strip him bare. And he had passed, not for the crowd, not for the soldiers, but for himself. Because when you've lived through the fire, you no longer need to prove who you are. You simply are. And that night, as the city lights twinkled in the distance, Marcus Steele knew one thing for certain. The battles might change, but the warrior within him never would. The morning after the tense standoff, the city was buzzing. The incident had spread quickly through social media. Videos from shaky cell phones were replayed over and over. A strong man standing still as rifles pointed at his chest, his calm presence defying the chaos around him. Some clips cut off right when the officer shouted, "Stand down!" Others froze the moment Marcus lowered his hands, his face steady and unshaken. For many people, the footage became a source of debate. Some said, he must have been guilty of something. Why else would the guard stop him? Others replied, no, you can see it in his eyes. He wasn't afraid because he had nothing to hide. But as the arguments grew, so did the misunderstandings. Marcus Steele wasn't thinking about online debates, though. He had spent the night quietly, as he always did, reflecting, writing a few lines in his leather notebook and sipping coffee as dawn broke. He wasn't chasing attention, nor did he crave sympathy. His life had taught him that truth doesn't need to shout. Truth has a way of revealing itself, even if slowly. But while Marcus sought peace, the world wasn't ready to give it to him. By mid-morning, reporters were already at his apartment building. Cameras flashed when he stepped out to buy groceries. Questions were hurled at him like stones. Mr. Steele, were you resisting arrest? Did the National Guard target you unfairly? Are you going to press charges? Marcus paused on the steps, bags in hand, and looked at the cluster of microphones shoved in his direction. He sighed, then answered in his steady baritone, I'm not here to press charges. I'm here to live my life. What happened yesterday was a misunderstanding. But misunderstandings can be dangerous if we let them grow unchecked. The reporter scribbled furiously. His words weren't angry. They were deliberate, chosen with care. But even as he spoke, Marcus knew not everyone would hear him correctly. Some would twist his calmness into weakness. Others would call it arrogance. And he was right. Later that day, the news channels ran their headlines. Suspicious man nearly arrested by National Guard. Hero or threat? The debate around Marcus Steele. Former soldier at center of public controversy. The irony wasn't lost on Marcus. In their rush to make a story, they left out the truth. He was more than just a former soldier. He was a Delta force commander who had once risked his life to protect the same freedoms that allowed those very headlines to be written. The misunderstanding didn't stop there. At the local cafe, whispers followed him. A group of men at the corner table fell silent when he walked in. A woman waiting in line shifted nervously, clutching her purse closer. Not everyone recognized him, but those who did had different stories in their heads. That's the guy from the video, one man muttered. Yeah, the one who caused trouble with the guard, another replied. Marcus heard it all. His hearing had been sharpened by years of combat. He could catch words even when people thought they were whispering. But he didn't respond. He ordered his black coffee, nodded politely to the barista, and sat at a corner table. As he sipped, his mind drifted back to his service days. He remembered the missions where misunderstandings nearly cost lives. A villager mistaken for an enemy, a shadow seen as a weapon. Each time he had learned that perception was powerful and dangerous. And now, here at home, he saw the same lesson repeating itself. But amidst the suspicion, there were also voices of support. At a nearby park that evening, a young man approached him shyly. He couldn't have been more than 19, his uniform still crisp and new. Sir, I saw the video, the young soldier stammered. I just wanted to say, I'm sorry. Not because it was me pointing the rifle, I wasn't there, but because we should know better. We're trained to protect, not assume. Marcus studied him for a long moment. The boy's eyes were honest, wide with sincerity. Finally, Marcus placed a hand on his shoulder. Don't carry guilt that isn't yours, Marcus said, but carry the lesson. That's how we change. The boy nodded, his face brightening with relief, and hurried off. Still, the misunderstandings kept multiplying. Online, strangers argued fiercely in comment sections. Some painted Marcus as a dangerous figure who had gotten away with something. Others elevated him to near mythical status, calling him the calm commander or the unshakable man. But Marcus knew the truth lay somewhere in between. He wasn't a villain, and he wasn't a superhero. He was just a man who had stood his ground with dignity. That was all. And yet he also knew how quickly misunderstandings could escalate. Today it was rumors and headlines. Tomorrow it could be another confrontation, another rifle pointed his way. As night fell, Marcus sat again by his window, looking out over the glowing city. He wrote a single sentence in his notebook. Strength is not in fighting the misunderstanding, it is in living beyond it. He closed the book, leaned back, and let the quiet wash over him. The next morning brought more challenges. At the grocery store, an older man blocked his path. You think you're some kind of hero? The man spat. Walking around like you're better than the rest of us, making the soldiers look bad? Marcus's instinct told him to diffuse, not escalate. He met the man's glare with calm eyes. I'm no better than anyone, Marcus replied softly. I'm just a man who knows what it feels like to be judged too quickly." The man's anger faltered, though his pride didn't let him apologize. He muttered something under his breath and walked away. Marcus let him go. He had learned long ago that not every battle was worth fighting. By the end of the week, Marcus realized something profound. The misunderstanding wasn't just about him. It was about everyone. It was about a society quick to judge, quick to assume, quick to divide. And maybe, just maybe, his experience could become more than a viral video. Maybe it could become a reminder, not because he wanted fame, not because he wanted pity, but because he believed in something greater than himself, the power of dignity in the face of misunderstanding. And so, instead of retreating further into his quiet life, Marcus made a choice. He began speaking, not loudly, not angrily, but clearly. At community gatherings, he shared his perspective. To small groups of young recruits, he talked about patience, discipline, and respect. To neighbors who asked, he explained what it meant to live with both strength and humility. Everywhere he went, he carried the same message. Don't let misunderstanding be the end of the story. Let it be the beginning of learning. The misunderstanding had started with rifles pointed at his chest, but now it was growing into something different, something stronger, something healing. And Marcus Steele, the man once seen as suspicious, was becoming a living example of what it means to rise above. That night, Marcus couldn't sleep. He lay on his bed staring at the ceiling, the quiet hum of the city outside his window filling the silence. His body was still, but his mind was restless, pulled back into the memories he carried inside him like a soldier carries scars. The incident with the National Guard hadn't just been a confrontation on the street. It had unlocked the doors of his past, doors he had carefully kept closed for years. Now images returned to him with a force he couldn't stop, scenes playing like an old film, reminding him of where he had come from and the life that had shaped him into the man he was. He remembered the desert first, the heat, the dry air that cut into his throat, the sand that stung his skin like tiny blades whenever the wind picked up. His team had been on a mission to rescue hostages, and the odds had been stacked against them. They were outnumbered, deep in enemy territory, with only faith in each other to guide them through. Marcus could still hear the whispers in his headset, the nervous breaths of the younger men who looked to him for direction. He had been afraid too, though he never showed it. Fear was natural, but letting fear control you was deadly. So with his calm voice, he reminded them that they would get everyone out alive. And when the time came, they moved with precision. The firefight that followed was brutal, but they succeeded. Marcus carried one of the children out of the compound on his back. That boy's terrified eyes had softened into trust when he realized he was safe. That moment was etched into Marcus's soul, a reminder that honor was not about medals or titles. It was about being there for the helpless, no matter the cost. Then came the memory of the jungle, thick rain pouring from the sky, the earth soft with mud beneath his boots and the smell of damp leaves and danger in every breath. His unit had been trapped for hours, enemy forces circling dangerously close. Every crack of a branch felt like thunder, every shadow a threat. His men's faces were pale with fear, their fingers tightening around their rifles. In that moment, Marcus had become their anchor. He signaled silence, and they obeyed, lying motionless in the mud as enemies passed so close they could hear their voices. Time dragged, but Marcus never wavered, and because of that, neither did his men. When the chance finally came, he led them out slowly, quietly, every movement calculated. Not one life was lost. Later, the men told him they had survived not because they had better weapons, but because they had a leader who didn't break when everything around them threatened to fall apart. But not all his memories were victories. Some carried the weight of loss, a weight Marcus still carried in his chest like a stone. He thought of Sergeant Daniels, his closest friend, a man who could make the whole unit laugh even in the darkest hours. Daniels had been more than a soldier. He was family. They had promised each other they would both make it home, but war doesn't honor promises. Daniels had fallen during a raid, and Marcus had been the one to carry his body back. The memory still stung, and sometimes when Marcus closed his eyes, he could still hear Daniels' laugh echoing, only to vanish into silence. That loss reminded Marcus that honor was not only about the victories you celebrated, but about the grief you carried with dignity. Lying there in his bed, Marcus realized how these flashbacks explained the calm he had shown on the street that day. When the rifles were pointed at him, It wasn't arrogance that made him stand steady, it was experience. He had already seen worse. He had stared into the face of death more times than he could count, and he had learned that panic never saved lives, but calm often did. The young soldiers who had surrounded him didn't know that. They couldn't see the years carved into his soul. To them, he was just a suspicious man, but Marcus knew his silence that day had spoken louder than words ever could. The truth was, honor doesn't shout. It doesn't demand recognition. It lives in the quiet choices, in the moments where no one else sees but you still choose to do what's right. Honor was what made him carry children out of danger, what made him lead his men through storms of fire, and what made him hold his head high even when rifles were pointed at his chest for something he hadn't done. Honor wasn't something the world gave him. It was something he had chosen over and over again, even when the cost was heavy. As the hours passed and dawn began to creep through his window, Marcus sat up and rubbed his face. He thought about the soldiers who had pointed guns at him, and he didn't feel hatred. He thought about the crowd that had judged him with their whispers, and he didn't feel bitterness. What he felt was responsibility. His life had given him lessons most people would never experience, and maybe it was his duty now to share those lessons, not to glorify himself, but to remind others that strength and honor can exist even in silence. He got up, poured himself another cup of coffee, and stared out at the rising sun. The city was waking up, people beginning another day, unaware of the thoughts running through his mind. But Marcus knew something with complete certainty. The flashbacks that haunted him were not curses. They were reminders. Reminders that he had lived, that he had fought, that he had stood for something bigger than himself. And now, even in the quiet life he had chosen, those reminders were still guiding him. When he stepped out of his apartment later that morning, the world looked the same. But Marcus felt different. The street where he walked was just another city street, but to him it was also a battlefield of perception, a place where judgment and misunderstanding had clashed against his dignity. He walked calmly, head high, not because people now whispered about him as a commander or a hero, but because he knew the truth of his own life. He knew the honor he carried inside, and that truth could never be taken away. The days after the confrontation seemed to pass slowly, though the city itself never stopped moving. Traffic filled the streets. People rushed to their jobs, markets buzzed with life, but in every corner, whispers of Marcus Steele's name seemed to linger. The video of him standing motionless in front of raised rifles had spread further than he expected. Strangers recognized his face, some with admiration, others with suspicion. To most of them, he was still just a mystery, a man who hadn't reacted the way they thought an ordinary man would. But the truth about Marcus was about to find its way into the open, not by his choice, but by the weight of history finally stepping forward. The senior officer who had shouted for his men to stand down could not rest easy. He had carried a knot in his chest since that day, a mixture of shame and gratitude. The shame came from realizing how close they had come to dishonoring a man who had given his life to the service of the country. The gratitude came from knowing that Marcus Steele had once saved his life years ago, in a desert half a world away. That officer remembered clearly the heat, the bullets, the chaos, and the calm voice that had guided him and his unit out of certain death. That voice belonged to Marcus. And now, years later, he had been seconds away from letting his own soldiers treat Marcus as a criminal. It was something he could not stay silent about. When he finally called for a press gathering, the room was full. Reporters expected the usual vague statements and rehearsed words. But instead, the officer's voice carried a heaviness that silenced the chatter. He told them who Marcus Steele really was. Not a suspicious man on the street. Not an ordinary veteran. A commander of Delta Force. A man who had led operations that would never make headlines. Who had saved lives countless times. Who had carried the weight of responsibility most people could never imagine. The words hung in the air like a revelation. Cameras flashed, pens scratched across notepads, but for once the noise of the world didn't drown out the truth. When the news spread, the city shifted. The same people who had whispered suspicion now whispered awe. The same mouths that had doubted began to speak with respect. At the cafe where Marcus often sat quietly with his black coffee, the conversations changed. Instead of wary glances, there were nods of recognition. Instead of mutters of distrust, there were murmurs of pride. Some felt guilty for judging him too quickly. while others saw him as a reminder that heroes can walk among them without seeking attention or praise. Marcus, however, felt no need to celebrate this sudden change in perception. He had lived long enough to know that truth often comes late, and respect given too late is not what defines a man's worth. What mattered to him was not the headlines or the admiration, but the lesson that might grow from it all. When a reporter finally cornered him and asked for a statement, Marcus didn't deliver anger or victory. Instead, he spoke with the same calm strength that had defined him in battle. He told them he had not stood still in front of rifles because he wanted recognition. He had stood still because he knew anger would solve nothing, because dignity was more powerful than rage, and because he had learned that patience could be the sharpest weapon a man carried. His words were not dramatic, but they cut through the noise and found their way into the hearts of many who heard them. Old comrades soon came to visit him, men who had once followed his lead into darkness, who had trusted his steady hand when the world was falling apart. They sat in his small living room, trading stories that outsiders would never understand, laughing about close calls and remembering the faces of those who hadn't made it back. They told him that what he had done on that street was no different from what he had always done, leading by example, showing strength not through force, but through composure. One of them told him, "You didn't just survive that moment. You taught everyone watching what honor really looks like." Marcus smiled faintly, grateful for the reminder that his quiet way of living still spoke louder than words. Yet Marcus knew the truth being revealed was not about making him a hero. It was about exposing something deeper, something uncomfortable. The rifles pointed at him that day were not only pointed at a man, they were pointed at the years of honor, sacrifice, and humanity that people had failed to see. And that was the true lesson. People are too quick to judge, too quick to assume, too blind to look beyond the surface. His story was not about a commander being misjudged. It was about every human being who carries a story unseen. When Marcus walked the same street weeks later, the one where rifles had surrounded him, it looked unchanged. The same stores, the same sidewalks, the same hum of the city. But for him, everything had changed. Strangers who recognized him nodded with respect. Some stopped to thank him. Teenagers whispered his name in awe as he passed. But Marcus walked with the same steady stride, unshaken, calm, not seeking their approval. His truth had never depended on their recognition. His honor had never needed their applause. For Marcus Steele, the revelation of who he was not the ending of the story. It was only a reminder. A reminder that the real victory is not in what the world says about you, but in living every day with dignity, calm, and honor. Because the truth may take time to be seen, but a life built on strength and integrity cannot be hidden forever. And when it finally shines through, it doesn't just reveal a man's story, it teaches others how to live their own. Marcus Steele never thought of himself as a teacher. He had spent most of his life as a soldier, a leader, and later as a quiet man blending into civilian life. But after the truth about him was revealed, after the city and even the country learned who he really was, something began to change. People didn't just see him as the man who stood calm in front of rifles. They began to see him as a voice worth listening to. And slowly, though he hadn't asked for it, Marcus realized he had a new mission. Not on foreign soil, not in secret operations, but right here at home. His mission was to turn a painful misunderstanding into a lesson people would carry with them, long after the video of that day faded from memory. It started small. A few young soldiers came to his door one evening. Their uniforms were fresh, their faces nervous, their voices shaky with the weight of respect. "Commander Steele," one of them said softly, we were wrong. Not just us, but all of us. We're trained to react quickly, to judge fast. But you showed us that sometimes strength isn't in pulling the trigger, it's in waiting. We want to learn from you." Marcus looked at them, and for a moment he was back in the barracks years ago, staring into the eager eyes of new recruits who didn't yet understand what war would demand of them. He nodded, motioned for them to sit, and shared stories, not about glory, but about patience, about courage, about how being a soldier wasn't about power, it was about responsibility. When they left, their eyes held something new, understanding. Soon after, schools began asking him to speak. Community centers invited him, not because he was famous, but because his calm in the face of fear had become an example parents wanted their children to see. Standing in front of classrooms filled with teenagers, Marcus didn't give them speeches about medals or wars. He told them about dignity, about the importance of looking at people without judgment, about how strength was not about fists or guns, but about how you carried yourself when the world pushed against you. One day, he told them, you'll face a moment where everything in you wants to lash out, to prove yourself, to fight. But the real fight is inside. The real strength is in staying calm, in choosing the harder path of patience. That's the lesson life taught me. The students listened in silence, their eyes fixed on him, and Marcus saw in them the reflection of hope, that maybe the next generation would learn faster than the one before. But perhaps the most powerful lesson wasn't in what Marcus said publicly, it was in how he lived each day. He still walked the same streets, still drank his black coffee at the corner cafe, still nodded politely at strangers. He never let the sudden respect change him, because his dignity had never depended on applause. That consistency, that quiet steadiness became the lesson itself. People began to say he doesn't just talk about strength, he is strength, and that inspired more than any headline could. One afternoon, Marcus was walking when he noticed a commotion near the park. A group of soldiers in training uniforms were confronting a teenager who had been skateboarding too close to the memorial. Their voices were sharp, their stance aggressive. The boy looked terrified. Marcus stepped closer, his deep voice breaking the tension. Is this what you think strength looks like? The soldiers froze, realizing who stood before them. Marcus walked to the boy, put a hand on his shoulder, and said calmly, "Go on, son. Be careful next time." The boy nodded quickly and ran off. Then Marcus turned back to the soldiers. You wear the uniform, and that makes people look at you with fear or with trust. Which one do you want it to be? Because every choice you make decides that. Remember this, you protect best when people don't fear you, but when they respect you. None of the soldiers argued. They lowered their heads, ashamed, but also grateful for the correction. That day, they carried home a lesson they would never forget. The incident reminded Marcus of something his own father had once told him. The true mark of a man is not how much power he holds, but how he uses it when no one is watching. That truth had guided Marcus through war zones and through quiet city streets alike. Now he wanted it to guide others too. He began writing in his notebook more often, turning his memories into stories of honor, loss, courage, and patience. Not for himself, but so others could learn. His words were plain, his language simple, but each page carried the weight of a life lived with purpose. One evening, as he closed his notebook, Marcus looked out the window and thought of the people who had judged him, the rifles that had been raised against him, the whispers that had filled the crowd. He felt no bitterness. Instead, he felt gratitude. Because without that moment, without that misunderstanding, perhaps he would never have realized that his story still had work to do. Perhaps he would have lived quietly, carrying his lessons only for himself. But life had pushed him into the light again, and now he saw the reason. His battles were no longer fought with weapons, they were fought with wisdom, and so the lesson spread. People who once whispered suspicion now spoke with admiration, not just for what Marcus had done in the past, but for what he represented in the present. Soldiers repeated his words during training. Teachers shared his story in classrooms. Parents pointed him out to their children as an example of dignity. The rifles that once symbolized misunderstanding had become, in the end, a reminder that calm strength can turn fear into respect, and that patience can teach more than anger ever could. As Marcus walked home one evening under the fading glow of the sun, a young girl passing by tugged her mother's sleeve and whispered, "That's the man who didn't get angry." Marcus smiled faintly at the words. It was simple, almost childlike, but it was the truth. That was how he wanted to be remembered, not as a commander, not as a hero, but as a man who chose calm when the world expected rage, because in that calm was the greatest lesson of all. The city never truly went back to normal after that day. Streets still bustled with life, but people looked differently at each other, as if they carried a quiet reminder of what they had seen in Marcus Steele. For Marcus himself, life remained simple. He still rose before the sun, still brewed his coffee black, still walked the same streets with the same steady stride. Yet inside, something had shifted. The misunderstanding that had nearly reduced him to a suspect had instead elevated him to a teacher, a living reminder of what calm dignity could accomplish. But Marcus didn't live for recognition. He lived for meaning. And every step he took reminded him that meaning comes not from what the world says about you, but from how you choose to walk through it. On one of his morning walks, Marcus passed the same corner where rifles had once been raised at him. The memory returned, not as a wound, but as a marker, a turning point. The spot was ordinary, yet it had become extraordinary in his story. He paused for a moment, looking at the place where the crowd had gathered, where suspicion had turned into revelation. Now children played there, skateboards rattling against the pavement, laughter replacing the fear that had once filled the air. Marcus allowed himself a small smile. Life had moved on, as it always does, but the lesson remained carved into the hearts of those who witnessed it. Marcus's days began to fill more with people than solitude. Young men sought him out for advice, not just about military life, but about how to live with steadiness in a world that tested patience daily. Neighbors stopped him on the street to thank him, not for his past as a commander, but for the way he had shown them the power of restraint and respect. Even those who had once whispered suspicion now greeted him with warmth. Yet Marcus never allowed it to change the way he carried himself. Fame fades, he often reminded himself, but character endures, and so he kept his life rooted in humility. One afternoon, while sitting on a park bench, an older man approached him. His face was lined with years, his hands trembling slightly as he leaned on a cane. "You don't know me," the man said, voice rough but steady. "But I was there that day. I was one of the ones who judged you without knowing. I whispered things I'm ashamed of now. But watching you stand calm, it taught me more than I can explain. I wanted to thank you before my time runs out." Marcus reached out, clasped the man's hand firmly, and said, "It's never too late to learn. That's the only thanks I need." The man's eyes filled with tears, and for Marcus that moment carried more weight than any medal ever could. At night, Marcus still wrote in his leather notebook. Page after page he poured out stories of missions, of brothers lost, of lessons learned in the harshest conditions, not to glorify himself but to capture the essence of what honor meant to him. He hoped that one day when he was gone, someone would read those words and understand that greatness is not measured by power or titles, but by the quiet choices a person makes in moments of trial. The most profound change, however, was not in how others saw Marcus, but in how he saw himself. For years he had lived quietly, believing his time of impact had ended when he hung up his uniform. But life had shown him that the battles never truly end. They simply change shape. Where once he fought with weapons and strategy, now he fought with wisdom and example. And in many ways, this battle was harder. It demanded patience when he wanted to shout, humility when others placed him on a pedestal, and forgiveness for those who had misjudged him. Yet Marcus embraced it, because he understood that strength without compassion was incomplete. As weeks turned into months, Marcus became less of a mystery and more of a symbol. His name was spoken not with fear or suspicion, but with respect. Children pointed at him with curiosity. Parents told his story as a lesson, and soldiers repeated his words during training sessions. But Marcus himself never chased that. He continued to live as he always had, calm, grounded, content in the simple act of walking through life with dignity. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Marcus took one final walk down the street where everything had begun. The sky was painted in deep shades of gold and crimson, the air warm and alive with the hum of the city. He moved slowly, deliberately, each step carrying the weight of memory and the freedom of release. People recognized him and nodded respectfully, but Marcus didn't stop for attention. His stride remained the same, steady, unbroken, unshaken. He had nothing left to prove. As he reached the end of the block, a young boy ran up to him, breathless, holding a small notebook. "Mr. Steele," the boy said shyly, "my teacher told us about you. She said you taught everyone not to judge people too fast. Will you write something in my notebook? Just a line so I can remember." Marcus took the notebook, thought for a moment, then wrote in his firm handwriting. "Strength is not shown in anger. It is shown in calm." He handed the notebook back, ruffled the boy's hair gently, and walked on. That was Marcus Steele's way. He didn't need applause. He didn't need the world to chant his name. What mattered was that he had lived his truth, carried his honor, and left behind lessons that would outlast him. He had turned suspicion into respect, misunderstanding into wisdom, and fear into calm. And as he walked away from the street where his life had changed forever, he knew deep in his heart that he wasn't walking away defeated. He was walking away stronger. Stronger not because of the battles he had fought, but because of the dignity with which he had chosen to live.